On November 5th, 2024, Donald Trump was elected as the 47th President of the United States. But despite the fact that he still hasn't been sworn back into office, he has alluded several times to a possible annexation of Canada as the 51st state, as well as a desire to purchase Greenland from Denmark and also take back control of the Panama Canal. But the question is, why? What is it about Canada and Greenland that has Trump so interested? Is it oil? Is it minerals? Is it security? Well, if you turn to mainstream media outlets like the MSNBC to answer this question for you, you might hear something like this.
Well, I'm not going to sane-wash Donald Trump by trying to describe what motives he might have, other than to say that he has an expansionist view that is very much in line with his hero Vladimir Putin, who apparently also wants to seize land that doesn't belong to his country.
Wow, truly amazing analysis there. But in all seriousness, what if I told you there is actually a method to the madness here? What if I told you there is actually a very compelling reason for Trump's interest, and it has everything to do with controlling the Arctic? Now, before we understand why the Arctic is such a key issue geopolitically, we need to first understand what the Arctic actually is. Now, unlike Antarctica, which is just a huge plot of land, the Arctic is actually made of a bunch of different plots of land across different countries. This right here is what is known as the Arctic zone, and anything above this line would be considered a part of the Arctic. Now, in the past, the Arctic waterways were considered too dangerous and very narrow and almost impossible to navigate. But as we know, there is this little thing that's been happening over the past couple of decades, and that is the melting of the ice caps. And the more ice that melts in the Arctic, the easier it's going to be to navigate that area with ships. Now, what this has meant is that a lot of countries are looking at the Arctic pathways as a potentially much better way to ship products rather than using the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. And that is simply because this route is just shorter, so that means you can get there faster and it's going to cost you less money to ship your products. But of course, as these pathways are emerging, there's also a lot of claim over which of these waters are international waters and which of these are not. And that has potentially huge ramifications as far as who gets to ship from which pathway and how much do they have to pay in return. Now, there are two main pathways in the Arctic: the Northeast Pathway and the Northwest Pathway. As you can see, if you're taking the Northeast Pathway, you're going above countries like Russia, Norway, and Finland, whereas if you're taking the Northwest Passage, you're going above Alaska, Canada, and in between Canada and Greenland. So particularly if you want to take the Northwest Passage, you have to make sure you come to some sort of an agreement with Canada and also with Denmark, which is the country that owns Greenland. Because again, some of these waters are considered internal waters, not international waters. As such, you have to have an agreement with the country that you're entering in order to pass through. Now, why this is so significant for someone like Trump is that if he can control this pathway, he would have a significant amount of leverage over China. Now, of course, the Chinese economy relies heavily on shipping products to foreign countries all across the world. But if in a hypothetical scenario, they were denied access to this pathway, but some of their main competitors like Vietnam or Bangladesh were allowed to use those pathways, then the Chinese products would have a very tough time remaining competitive because their shipping costs are just so much more than their competitors. So if Trump could get control of this pathway and use it in his negotiations with China, he would have a lot of leverage to ask for whatever he wants in return. And of course, an evidence to back up this claim is the fact that he is also focusing on regaining control of the Panama Canal, which is definitely illustrating that he is trying to use shipping routes in order to control the economy of the world. But I guess the real question is it actually feasible for Trump to get control of either Canada or Greenland, or maybe just this pathway? Now let's begin with what is probably the least feasible, and that is Canada becoming a 51st state. First of all, I should just mention that Canada is larger than all other 50 states combined, so this whole 51st state doesn't even make sense. It would have to be at least 10 additional states, but that's besides the point. But annexing Canada is extremely unfeasible. There would have to be so many things that would have to align together. There would have to be approval from the King of England because, yes, I know we are an independent country, but he is still our king. I don't know why, don't ask me that. And of course, as well as that, the parliament is just never gonna go for annexing into US. I mean, let's just put it this way, I would be shocked if this actually happens. But just because Trump says this and throws this out there doesn't mean that that's what he's actually looking for. In fact, there's a famous expression, aim for the stars so you can land on the moon. And that might be what Trump is trying to do here by proposing something outlandish so that something a little bit less outlandish actually looks like a reasonable idea. For example, this is what Kevin O'Leary had to say when he went on Fox News.
The concept of an economic union has been bandied around for 40 years, and it makes sense because the resources Canada have, the U.S. needs, particularly power and water. If you figured out a way to put these two countries together, it would be the most powerful country on earth, the most powerful military on earth, the most powerful in resources. And no adversary anywhere would mess with it. The opportunity is combining strengths. You don't have to sell the country, you don't have to even merge it, but you can create a union where you put together the things that matter: a common currency, a common passport, free-flowing trade across the border, particularly in energy.
So what Mr. Wonderful is proposing here is that instead of annexing Canada, we could form a union similar to, let's say, the UK. Now, the UK, if you are not aware, is basically a union of 4 countries. Those 4, of course, are England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So the UK is actually not just one country, it's 4 separate countries. It's just that they formed a unity and they have a central government that deals with stuff like foreign policy, monetary policy, or security. Whereas for stuff like domestic laws and regulations, those are handled by each country for their own people. And what Mr. Wonderful is proposing is something similar, where we have a unified passport just like the British, and we also have a central government that controls stuff like foreign policy, monetary policy, and military. But in this example, Canada and the United States would remain 2 separate countries. It's just that they would form a union, again similar to the UK or even the European Union. Now, this idea is more feasible than annexing Canada into the United States, but there's a lot of negotiations that would have to go into this. So is it feasible? Yes, it's feasible. Is it likely? Probably not. And that leaves us with the most feasible option, which is that Trump wants to leverage Canada with the threat of tariffs in order to be able to influence Canada's decision-making regarding the Northwest Passage. This is probably the most likely scenario of what's actually happening here. Of course, there's been a lot of disputes over Canada's tariffs and what that could do to the Canadian economy. And again, if you look at Trump as a negotiator, this is clearly Trump trying to find the leverage in order to influence Canada's decision-making, so that through threatening Canada with tariffs, he can gain the ability to threaten China with access to trade routes. But you might ask, what about Greenland? Is that one actually feasible? Well, to put it simply, it is much more feasible than Canada, simply for the fact that you're not absorbing an entire country, rather you're just absorbing a territory that doesn't have exactly the highest population out there. Now, I would argue that purchasing Greenland is actually much more important than trying to annex Canada in some way or another, because the US has an extensive trade network with Canada and is therefore able to influence its decision making. But the American influence over the Kingdom of Denmark is at least nowhere near as it is on Canada. So if you want to influence their decision making as far as the trade routes surrounding Greenland, you don't really have the ability to do that, at least nowhere near with something like Canada. Now, of course, the Danish authorities have said that Greenland is not for sale, but truly in this world, everything has a price. You just have to meet that price. For example, and of course this is an extreme example, but if the US was willing to, let's say, pay 10 times what Greenland is actually worth, would Denmark really say no to that? Now, do they have that kind of money? Probably not. They're massive debt, but clearly everything is for sale. You just have to find the right solution. So is the acquisition of Greenland actually feasible? Definitely more than Canada, but I still wouldn't put my money on it. Now, that's about it for this video. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you think is the most feasible outcome for Canada and Greenland? If you enjoyed this video, then do me a favor and smash the like button down below for the YouTube algorithm. And also, if you want to see more videos like this, then smash the subscribe button down below as well. But with that said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.